dramatic shakeup. The Trump administration has torched a 30-year-old trade agreement that slapped a 17% tariff on fresh tomatoes from Mexico.
The U.S. government announcing a new 17% tariff on most fresh Mexican tomatoes.
A new policy kicks in today, making way for a 21% price hike on tomato import.
For 3 decades, a quiet but essential pillar underpinned North America's agricultural trade, a pact that guaranteed the steady flow of fresh tomatoes across borders. It was the sort of agreement few citizens ever noticed, but countless families, towns, and regional economies depended upon. Then, with the flourish of a pen and the rhetoric of disruption, the Trump administration torched the deal. Overnight, a 17% tariff was reimposed on Mexican tomatoes, reigniting an old quarrel and thrusting a basic commodity into the arena of political theater. Yet, the tariff was only the first tremor in a much larger earthquake. Within days, Canada announced its own refusal of American tomatoes, citing pesticide residues and quality concerns. On paper, it looked like routine regulatory housekeeping. In practice, it was a calculated maneuver, one that signaled a shift in the balance of agricultural power across the continent. Tomatoes, once the humblest of crops, had suddenly become the opening act in a drama about sovereignty, trade, and survival. What followed was not simply a trade dispute. It was the slow-motion unraveling of a system that had carried small towns, fed families, and reassured global buyers for decades. And as trucks idled at borders, crops withered in fields, and communities braced for the fallout, the world was reminded of a brutal truth. In the politics of food, nothing is ever just about food. Canada's move came cloaked in the dry language of bureaucracy. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency issued a statement, citing pesticide residues and recurring concerns about quality. To the casual reader, it sounded routine, a technical correction in a regulatory manual, the sort of announcement that typically lands on page 12 of a government bulletin. But buried beneath the jargon was a decision calculated with precision to sever dependence on American tomatoes and rewire the continent's agricultural map. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Within 48 hours, the once bustling border crossings resembled ghost towns. Nearly 150 truckloads of California tomatoes sat stranded at the Peace Bridge, refrigeration units humming as the clock ticked down on their value. Another 89 shipments idled at the Ambassador Bridge, drivers waiting helplessly while their cargo withered. These were not just numbers in a spreadsheet. They represented a $340 million annual flow of revenue, the lifeblood of 2,400 American farming families. Mortgages, school budgets, and rural hospitals all leaned on that stream. With one ruling, it was cut off. The timing exposed the cruelty behind the technocratic language. Only weeks earlier, Canada had finalized $180 million in contracts with greenhouse growers in Ontario and British Columbia. Facilities were fast-tracked, publicly funded, and designed to replace, almost pound for pound, the volume once imported from California. By the time regulators delivered their pesticide lecture, the alternative was already humming into operation. Tom Richardson, a veteran farmer outside Fresno, put it bluntly, "The problem isn't the crop. The problem is Canada found another supplier." His words captured what the official statement carefully avoided. Canada's rejection was not about residues or inspections. It was about reducing exposure to an unreliable partner. The first domino had fallen, and with it, the illusion that American supply was indispensable. The border closures did not merely halt shipments, they hollowed out entire towns. In places like Watsonville, Delano, and Fresno County, the rhythm of daily life was tied directly to the flow of produce across borders. When that flow stopped, the silence was deafening. Trucks that once thundered through the night now sat idle in parking lots. Tomatoes, once destined for dinner tables thousands of miles away, wilted under the California Sunday. For farmers, each passing hour was not an inconvenience but a small fortune evaporating into the dry air. The economic toll spread with the relentlessness of a contagion. Trucking firms, built on hauling produce north, slashed staff to skeleton crews. Fertilizer suppliers saw orders collapse. Repair shops, accustomed to steady business from farm machinery, stood quiet. Even the diners that fed drivers at all hours of the night began shutting their doors. The loss was not isolated to fields but rippled through every artery of rural commerce. Economists call it the multiplier effect. Locals had a simpler word: ruin. The statistics painted the devastation in sharper lines. Unemployment in farming counties surged past 30%. Property values across California's agricultural belt tumbled nearly 20% in just 6 months. Schools, starved of funding tied to enrollment, shuttered programs, and consolidated districts. Janet Morrison, superintendent in Delano, described the heartbreak of watching families pack up and leave. Each departure meant fewer students, fewer teachers, fewer opportunities. Hospitals followed the same grim trajectory, cutting services as patient counts dropped and unpaid bills mounted. For families who had worked the same land for generations, the collapse was more than financial. It was cultural, even existential. The soil that had carried their history was now a liability. Some walked away entirely, leaving behind homes, equipment, and memories too heavy to salvage. In coffee shops and county halls, the conversation shifted from weather and yields to survival and escape. What had begun as a trade dispute was revealed in its cruelest form. Not an abstract debate over tariffs or regulations, but a dismantling of the very fabric of rural America. The fallout was not theoretical. It was lived, in layoffs, foreclosures, and emptied classrooms. While American farmers were reeling from shock, south of the border another story was unfolding, one less about loss and more about calculated ambition. Mexico did not merely watch the chaos, it seized it. With uncanny timing, European agribusiness giants poured nearly $12 billion into Mexico's farming sector. The money did not vanish into vague promises or half-finished projects. It was deployed with surgical precision to build a 21st-century agricultural machine. $7 billion went directly into state-of-the-art greenhouses and hydroponic systems. These facilities operated year-round, immune to the weather swings that could cripple U.S. harvests. They consumed 40% less water than California's thirsty fields and churned out crops with astonishing consistency. Another $3 billion. Fortified logistics, new ports, highways, and storage facilities that turned perishable produce into reliable exports. The remainder flowed into education and research, cultivating a skilled workforce and embedding a culture of innovation that American agriculture, long complacent, had allowed to atrophy. The results were startling in their speed. Agricultural revolutions are supposed to take decades. Mexico accomplished one in 8 months. By the following season, premium Mexican tomatoes were already gracing European supermarket shelves, sold at nearly a quarter less than American exports. To buyers in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, the decision was effortless. A cheaper, steadier supply from a country eager to be a partner. Economists like Maria Elena Vasquez of the University of Guadalajara explain the symbolism plainly. At the very moment U.S. agriculture was losing trust, Mexico presented itself as stable and affordable. European buyers, long frustrated with American delays and disputes, shifted south without a second thought. Mexico's ascent was not just about tomatoes, it was about credibility. In a world shaken by energy shocks and supply chain fragility, Mexico positioned itself as agriculture's reliable anchor. While Washington argued over tariffs and California farmers counted their losses, Sinaloa, Sonora, and Baja California became the front lines of a new agricultural order. America's stumble had become Mexico's springboard, and the world noticed. At first glance, the collapse of tomato exports might appear like a narrow agricultural dispute, the sort of parochial quarrel between neighbors that rarely makes international headlines. But beneath the surface, something larger was shifting. Food, once treated merely as a commodity, had become a weapon of strategy, a lever of influence as potent as oil, gas, or rare earth minerals. The European Union, still scarred by its disastrous dependence on Russian energy, was quick to recognize the parallel. A continent that had learned the hard lesson of relying too heavily on a single supplier now sought resilience wherever it could find it. When the United States faltered, bogged down in internal disputes and bureaucratic inertia, Mexico appeared as a partner, offering consistency and security. To Brussels, this was not about tomatoes. It was about never again being held hostage by an unreliable source. Canada's rejection fit neatly into the same pattern. Officials could dress it up in regulatory language, but the underlying calculation was obvious. Reduce exposure to American volatility, invest in domestic production, and anchor food security closer to home. What began as a trade spat revealed itself as a continental realignment. The danger was not confined to tomatoes. Analysts quickly raised the question, if this can happen with a $340 million crop, what about wheat, soy, or corn, the staples that feed both the United States and the world? Once the aura of American reliability cracked, the alternatives became attractive. And once new supply chains were built, they would not be easily dismantled. The tomato dispute, then, was never just about fruit. It was about the shifting geometry of power, with agriculture firmly at its center. The collapse did not come solely from external pressure. It exposed weaknesses long festering within American agriculture. For decades, the U.S. had leaned on its reputation for abundance, assuming that sheer scale could substitute for innovation. But when compared to Mexico's new high-tech operations, the cracks widened into chasms. Consider water use. American tomato growers often require more than 3,000 gallons to produce a single ton of crop. Mexico's hydroponic systems, by contrast, achieve the same output with fewer than 2,000. The math is devastating. Mexico produces more with less, and does so year-round, shielded from the droughts and climate shocks that increasingly plague California's Central Valley. The same imbalance is visible in technology. American universities once pioneered greenhouse systems and automation, yet years of underfunding, bureaucratic red tape, and sluggish approval processes left breakthroughs gathering dust in research labs, while U.S. farmers struggled with outdated irrigation and labor-intensive harvests. European and Chinese firms brought their best systems directly into Mexico's fields. There, automation halved labor costs, sensors adjusted water and light in real time, and predictive models forecast demand weeks ahead. Even infrastructure became a liability. Processing plants, rail lines, and trucking fleets in the United States were built for volumes that no longer exist. Operating under capacity, costs per shipment rose, making American exports even less competitive. Facilities that once symbolized dominance now felt like monuments to a bygone era. America had built its agricultural empire on predictability and scale. But in a world demanding efficiency, adaptability, and reliability, those virtues had eroded into liabilities. What Mexico showcased was not only cheaper production but a vision of agriculture America once led, and has now conspicuously abandoned. If technology and logistics revealed America's competitive weaknesses, finance delivered the final blow. For generations, agricultural lending in the United States rested on a single assumption: stability. Bankers issued loans with the quiet confidence that each year's harvest would find a buyer, that contracts would be honored, and that farmers, however slim their margins, would repay. When Canada slammed its doors shut, that assumption evaporated overnight. The consequences cascaded through ledgers and courtrooms. Loan delinquencies in tomato-producing regions surged by 78% in less than a year. Bankruptcy filings climbed 45%. Those numbers understate the damage, as many small farmers simply walked away, unable to afford the legal costs of formal collapse. Land that had been in families for generations was left abandoned, a silent reminder of broken promises and broken balance sheets. Banks, once eager to extend credit to safe agricultural borrowers, now demanded collateral few families could provide. What had been a lifeline became a noose, tightening around those already gasping. In coffee shops across the Central Valley, the conversation shifted from crop yields to foreclosure notices. The image of tomato-laden trucks idling at border crossings came to symbolize more than trade gridlock. They became monuments to a vanished certainty that American farming was bankable, predictable, and secure. That myth, once the bedrock of rural finance, had collapsed under the weight of a single policy shift. What began as a quarrel over tomatoes revealed itself as something far more consequential: the unraveling of America's agricultural supremacy. A 30-year trade arrangement unraveled in days. Communities that once pulsed with the rhythm of cross-border commerce fell silent. Farmers abandoned land that had anchored families for generations. And while the United States stumbled, Mexico vaulted forward, armed with foreign investment, modern technology, and a credibility the U.S. could no longer claim. The implications stretch well beyond a single crop. Tomatoes may have been the first domino, but they will not be the last. Wheat, soy, corn, commodities that feed not only a nation but the world, now sit exposed to the same vulnerabilities. Global buyers, burned once, will not hesitate to diversify again. For Europe, Mexico's rise signals security. For Canada, it means independence. For America, it is a warning. Agriculture has become a theater of power, no less strategic than energy or defense. And in this theater, the United States is discovering a painful truth. Dominance built on predictability can vanish overnight. The trucks at the border were not just carrying produce, they were carrying the end of an era,